Really, it's going to be a series teaching through the whole of the Sermon on the Mount. But it starts with the Beatitudes. And really, we're going to be not even doing... we might get to some of the Beatitudes today, but really we got to lay a lot of groundwork for... So, the Sermon on the Mount. All right. So this is a really cool teaching section that Jesus goes through. And it's given elsewhere in the Gospels, not in John really, but in Luke, we find this same teaching. The interesting thing is Luke gives this teaching kind of spread out over a couple of different talks. And this has led to people thinking that perhaps Jesus didn't really give a Sermon on the Mount. Perhaps it was a series of teachings that were collaborated and Matthew kind of put it into one. It's also possible that Jesus gave this teaching multiple times. But really, there's some key differences between Matthew and Luke, and we'll get into why that is as we go through. This is often called, we call it the Sermon on the Mount, but it's also called the ordination address. To the 12. Who are the 12? Good. But who are they? Anybody, you know all their names? I don't even, yeah, I always end up forgetting one.
Peter, Andrew, James, John. Some of the names.
Peter, Andrew, James, John.
Which one? Okay.
Yeah, Judas.
Thomas.
Matthew, Thomas.
Another Jude.
Yeah, Jude.
Another Simon.
Yep. The ordination address. This is what it's called in Luke.
Which names of which?
Yeah, this is Luke 6. So it's called that in Luke 6. So you can find that same. So people have called it this. People have called it. Let's see here. People have called it the Compendium of Christian Doctrine.
What?
So a compendium is like a collection of knowledge. So the Compendium of Christian Doctrine. So like when I go to a compendium, it's basically all of the knowledge that I would need to understand a given subject. So the Compendium of Christian Doctrine. We might dispute this because who does Jesus give this to?
Crowds.
Right, but who specifically? What is it to the church? Is it to who?
The disciples.
It's to Israel. Okay, so we're gonna dig into that. Some authors have called it the Magna Carta of the Kingdom. Anybody remember what the Magna Carta is? Huh? The Magna Carta was a document that basically limited the powers of the king and kind of set the stage for democracy.
Standard.
Yeah. So, but it's a great work. So, the Magna Carta of the Kingdom. Other people have called it the Manifesto of the King. So every great teacher has their manifesto. Typically, we hear manifesto, we think crazy, like guy up in the woods, right? The Unabomber had his manifesto. But this is the Manifesto of the King. But these are all names that people have called this particular sermon by, which kind of gives you a pretty good understanding of what's going on. The Sermon on the Plain, which is what's in Luke 6, these could be the same event. So the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon of the King on the Plains in Luke 6 could be the same event. it would really depend on where Jesus gives this particular sermon. Anybody remember where he gives it? Where is he when he gives this sermon? Well, but where? He's in Galilee. All right. Where specifically in Galilee? Do you remember?
Galilee, and Carpus, and Jerusalem, Judea.
He's on the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Galilee, as it's called in Greek. It's cool because it kind of looks like a harp. Okay, so they call it Lake Kinneret in Hebrew. Kinneret is harp. But okay, so it kind of looks like a harp from the air. It's really cool, and it's surrounded by mountains. On this far side, you've got Tyre and Sidon, and you've got like mountains kind of all around here that make up. There's like a couple of big channels where wind comes through, like this, but it's surrounded by mountains, and that's what makes the waves so big. So you think something the size of maybe Lake Tahoe. It's about how big the Sea of Galilee is, or the Lake Kinneret. Now there's a lot of wind that comes through here, but there's also a lot of really cool natural amphitheaters. So all of this is really high territory, and you go down to the lake, and you can have some pretty cool. There's some pretty cool villages that sit right along the shoreline. So Jesus is here in this region. There is a mountain in Israel that you can go to called the Mount of the Beatitudes, which is where there's a big Catholic church there. I have some pictures of it somewhere from when I went. But it's called the Church of the Beatitudes, and it's the Catholic site where they say this is where Jesus gives the sermon. I don't think that's true, but it's kind of the historical place because he's down by the water. Okay, so when he does this a couple of times where he'll be on the water, he'll either be on the water in a boat, and he's teaching to the crowds on the shoreline. You think, wow, that must be really noisy, but again, just natural amphitheater. But this seems to be, he might be in the foothills surrounding the lake. There's some different context. Like if you look at Luke 6, obviously doesn't have all the material that Matthew 5 through 7 does. And what authors would do in that time period is they'd write their gospels or write their letters or whatever to get across a certain point. So does anybody know what Matthew's how he frames Jesus? How does Matthew frame Jesus? As the king, right? So Matthew frames Jesus as king. How does John frame Jesus? Son of God. How does Luke frame Jesus?
Creator.
Luke frames Jesus as the Son of Man, which is Jesus' favorite title for himself, is Son of Man. How does Mark frame Jesus? As a servant. Okay, so they all have their thrusts of what they're trying to get across. Now, this is what's hard for our Western sensibilities to understand, but in Eastern writing styles, they don't care about the order of events. Okay, it's more important that the event happened, not necessarily in which order the events happened. So we can play with the timeline a little bit because we're trying to get across a certain point. That's very stylistic in that sense. So that's why you can have Luke 6 be a little different than Matthew 5 through 7, even though most of the teaching is there, because Matthew's trying to couch Jesus's what Jesus is teaching is a king kind of coming to his people. That's why you can have events out of order in the Gospels, and it's not really a problem. Because of how they wrote. Kind of an interesting way to think of this is, how many of you have seen the movie Sahara with Matthew McConaughey? It's called Sahara. Okay, so in Sahara, Matthew McConaughey's character is trying to find a Civil War Ironside battleship in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Okay?
Okay.
It's a great series of books, by the way, if you haven't read it. I forget who it's by. But this is one of those books. And he goes to a mosque in Africa. And he is trying to get information, because, the mosque is going to have historical information going back centuries. And he goes, I'm trying to find a Civil War ship that might have sailed up the river in whatever year it was. And he goes, the imam goes, do you know any significant events that happened around that time period? And Matthew McConaughey goes, why? He's like, because we use events to find dates. We don't use dates to find events. And that's very Eastern in the way that they do this. So remember how we were talking about how Jesus, when we were going through the parables, how Jesus would adopt parables from the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash, and he would put a different spin on it or tell it just in a little bit different way. That's what they did with their storytelling. Is they would take the events and maybe put them out of order. It's not the event didn't happen. It's just, how are we trying to tell the story? How are we trying to couch the information? Let's see here. Trying to parse through my notes to figure out. What's clear is what Jesus is doing is he's trying to communicate a solid moral ethic for the Jews at that time period. Okay, so people have said that when he says, for example, if you hate your brother, you've already committed murder in your heart, right? People say that he's intensifying the law. That's not what he's doing. He's not intensifying the law. He's revealing what the law has always said. Okay? The law, what does Paul tell us the law is? The law is a school teacher to train us. So it's not that Jesus is changing the law. It's not that he's intensifying it or adding to it. He's revealing to the people what the law has always said. Because what is the law trying to address? It's trying to address sin and our heart issue.
That shows no man is perfect, to therefore show the Pharisees, etc., that they cannot make it by their own goodness.
Right. Because remember, we talked about this last week. So there's the law, right, which are the 613 commandments that are given. But then what do the Pharisees do? They put this little fence around it. And we talked about how some of the things, like the number of steps you could take on the Sabbath day, or the exact height the parapet had to be around the roof, or the ritual washing of hands, things like that, so they wouldn't accidentally break the law. But Jesus is saying, no. See, the law has always been a teacher. The law is always meant to show us what's going on in here. And so Jesus isn't intensifying or making the law more strict. He's revealing what it's always said. Okay? So as we get into that, we need to. So he's underscoring the ethic and the moral that should be guiding Israel. Because it's really easy. In fact, we see this in Deuteronomy. What does Moses say as he's getting ready to die? What does he say to the people? He says, this commandment, the law, which I am giving to you, is not too difficult for you to keep. Right? So the law, at least the prescripts, the outward prescripts, are not hard to keep. But inwardly is the issue. It's the inside. Remember, God is always interested in what's going on internally, not what's going on externally. The external things, the law, are meant to point to an internal reality that we have an issue with. Does that make sense? Check. Any questions?
I don't think that was that obvious to them, though.
To whom?
The people then and now, is that the law is 613 was that obvious to them that internally, well, No, I haven't killed my brother, but boy, am I angry at him.
Right. Yeah. So again, he's using the law to establish this ethic and moral. We would call it maybe the kingdom ethic, right? That's what he's getting at. Is this is what the kingdom of God looks like? So he's underscoring the need for a savior because nobody can live up to this kingdom ethic, this kingdom moral that he's showing. And you're right. When Jesus calls out the Pharisees, remember he is a Pharisee, so he's calling out his own group from within. So he's saying, "Hey, you're a bunch of whitewashed tombs. You're clean on the outside, but you're what on the inside? You're you're rotten."
How could they see that by the 613 laws that, okay, they're hypothetically had their brother, how could they see that in the law that they were sinning?
Well, because the law points to, like that's what Paul says, the law points to this, that it's sin. It's always been a sin issue. So Paul says, I would not know what sin was, but for the law.
I'm thinking of
So,
specifically.
well, that was the thing. Be angry and sin not. Right? It's a commandment in the law. So anger in some instances is right.
Yeah.
Right? So it's righteous. I mean, think about Jesus. Jesus isn't going through the temple like turning over tables like this. You know, he's not just walking up and he's going through there and he's throwing tables. Money's flying everywhere. Animals are running everywhere. You can't say, "Oh, you Pharisees, you pit of vipers." You know, it's not saying it like that. He's getting angry, but he's angry, but he's not sinning, and he's showing through that behavior and through this kingdom ethic that there's a way for you to be angry at someone and not sin. There's a way for you to treat people and not sin. There's a way for you to live and not sin, but you have to live like me. And that's the hard part, right? That's why he needed to die, so he could, you know, put his life in us and all of that. But so So we need to dispense with this. He's not intensifying the law. He's showing the heart of the law. He's showing what the law really is teaching. The purpose is not to show the lost how to be saved. That's the fun thing. It's to show how those who are believers are to live and to act. All right. So, the Beatitudes. All right, so here's some cool things about the Beatitudes. It takes you, at least from maybe a non-grace perspective, it takes you from salvation to Christ-likeness. It kind of shows that trend as it goes through. Here's what true Christ-likeness looks like, and there are some good things that we can pull out of here. It shows, again, how we have a heart issue and how that heart issue gets rectified in us. So let's take a look. I don't want to erase this unless everybody's gotten everything they want, because I know I've been guilty of jumping on the gun too quick. All right. All right. So where is Jesus teaching?
The lake.
The lake. I know it always is weird to call it the Lake of Galilee, but in Greek it's Thalassia. And Thalassia is lake, not sea.
But you call it Knesset. Are they the same?
Knesset. Okay, so in Hebrew, it's called Lake Knesset because it's
Does that begin with a G?
Knesset.
So it's K.
Lake Knesset.
Well, isn't there a lake called Gennesaret?
No, not that I know. But Knesset is a harp.
Somewhere there probably is.
There might be. So yeah, K. It starts with K.
Okay.
All right. So Jesus, here's how we read this. Starting in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 1. Okay, we got about 15 minutes. When he saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. After he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to teach them, saying, who is part of the audience? So our audience here, and for this particular teaching, is the disciples. But who else is there? The crowds, right? Yep. Yep, and part of the crowd, so if we want to go smaller, our subset here, we've got Pharisees and scribes, right? Who else do we have? We have everyone else. We have the sinners, right? All right. So that's who we have. And of course, we have Jesus teaching. So he sits down and he begins to teach. So let's read this. It's probably familiar to most of us. He began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things about you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, because your reward is great in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets before you in the same way. All right. Who knows what blessed means?
A bad translation is happy, but peace of mind, joy.
Happy is not a bad translation. Okay. So, in Greek, let's take a look here. Got my notes up instead of my Bible.
Sometimes you don't really feel happy when you're being persecuted.
Right, but that's because we have a wrong understanding of what happy is.
Oh boy.
Okay, so remember one of the first messages I did a year ago now was about joy, right? And hope specifically. And how hope, we often think we use hope in a wishful sense, right? I hope tomorrow is going to be sunny and that it doesn't rain, right? I don't know, but I hope. Happy is kind of used like that. So happy comes from this word, okay, which speaks to chance or luck or something like that. But really, the word we're looking at here is, don't worry, yeah, Ian's writing on the board in Greek again. It's okay. So that might look like map, it's not. I misspelled it.
That's all right. You wouldn't know.
Okay. So in Greek, this is Makarios. Okay? Makarios does mean happy. Okay? It does mean happy. Okay? But it's not happy in the way that we think of it.
Of course not.
I know that. It means that, but it doesn't mean that. Yeah. All right, so happy. What do we mean when we say happy? In Latin, we get the Beatitudes. The reason we call it the Beatitudes is because beatitude is from the Latin. It also means happy or blessed. The English word from happy comes from happenstance. But unlike this chance or luck, a believer's God-given happiness is not based on physical circumstances, but on inner joy. So when we say happy, this is inner joy. This is not necessarily inner joy. Yes, it does bubble out, and it looks like happiness, like what we would think of normally. But this is an inner joy that Jesus is talking about here. There are no verb forms in these statements because these aren't commands. They are exclamatory, so they're more like Jesus is saying, that this is the state of those who are meek. This is the state of those who are poor in spirit. This is the state of those, they have this inner joy. The blessedness is both a current attitude toward God as well as a life of eschatological hope. Okay, so what is eschatology? Sort of.
Study of doctrine?
Nope, that's
Oh,
doxology.
future time, yeah.
Yeah, eschatos. So when we talk about, it's the last things. So the last things happen in the future, yes. But we're not just talking about the future, we're talking about the culmination, so the final things. So when we're talking about eschatology, these people have an eschatological hope or an eschatological joy that will see them through the circumstances that they're in. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So a blessed person is a righteous person, according to Psalm 119, 1 through 2. This blessedness begins with Jesus' disciples and followers, and now Paul even will appropriate that same blessedness for the church. When he talks about all the blessings in Christ, it's the same word. The blessings that we have in Christ, the happiness, the joy, that eschatological hope that we have. I'm going to start with one of the final ones because I think I'm running out of time here. Because I think it's important for us to see. So, what does it say about the meek? They will inherit the earth. Okay, earth, bad translation. All right. I understand why they do it. But who is Jesus talking to? I'm not giving you a trick question. Who's Jesus talking to? Right, but more specifically, who's Jesus talking to? No. Like the people group. Who is he talking to?
Israelites?
He's talking to Jews.
Jew.
Okay. Like I said, it's not a trick question. I'm not asking for mysteries here. This is the word in Greek. I know it looks like a fish and a squiggle.
That's the word for Greek, for Jews or for earth?
This is the word for earth. Okay? It's gay. Or we also get, from this we get Gaia. Right? So Gaia is the goddess of the earth in Greek and Roman mythology. But this is gay. Okay? So when Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," this can mean earth or land. It's not just, they didn't have this concept of the planet. Okay? They didn't think of it as a globe. They didn't think of it as a heavenly body floating through the earth. When they said earth, it's not talking about the planet. And I think we import our Western understanding into that when we look at this word. We think we have, now when we call it the earth, we think the planet, right? The globe.
So this is Israel.
Right. So when Jesus is saying...
It comes from Gentile, G-E, and T-I-L.
No.
What's a thought?
Oh, got it. Let me get tomorrow. So what is it?
So when we say earth, what is another way that we can use earth?
Land.
Land.
Yeah, you got it right.
So when we talk about the earth, we're talking about soil. We're talking about land.
Oh, gosh.
So when Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," he's not talking about capital E earth. He's talking about the literal dirt under their feet. What is the dirt under their feet? When the Jews hear the land, what are they? They're thinking the promises of Abraham, right? They're talking about physical Israel, the nation, the promised land. He's not talking about the planet.
Well, the government giving, they rule they won't let have it.
Okay? So think about how that would hit the ear of a first century hearer when Jesus is saying, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land." And the land in Israel is the promised land.
That was really exciting.
Right. So this is part of the reason why we want to look at the historic, we want to look at the grammatical context, we want to look at how the first century audience would receive it, because that in turn tells us what Jesus is actually saying. And that's going to be true for a lot of these different things, for a lot of these different Beatitudes. But this is the cool one. This is the one I wanted to show you today. Was often we think that Jesus is talking about capital E earth, when really he's talking about the eschatos for Israel. Who did Jesus come to? The Jews. He says, I have come to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So everything that he says needs to be couched in what he defined his ministry as, which is to Israel. Not to the earth, capital E, but to the earth, the soil, the land, the promised land. Okay?
And usually humble people don't get anything.
Right.
So it has to be given to them by God.
True, but meek doesn't also, we'll talk about this later, meek doesn't mean weak.
Oh, okay.
Strength under control.
Yeah.
Okay, next week.
So, yeah. Yeah. Because Joshua was meek, but he was not weak. Okay?
It's surprising they didn't want to take him as the Messiah in the future right then, because they've been waiting for him to be the conqueror.
Right, but he didn't.
Right, yeah.
He didn't come as a conqueror to begin with.
At
That's
first,
why. That's what.
true.
Yeah.
But
So
it's
he.
surprising they didn't just leave for joy at that, because that's what they were looking for right then.
Right. So in Luke, what is it, Luke 4, when Jesus comes and he does the Annunciation, right? I've been to that church too. It's kind of cool. It's a little building. It's what they say is where he did this. But in Luke 4, when he gets up and he says, he reads that passage from Isaiah, and he reads it and then he sits down and everybody's astonished. Do you know why they're astonished? Because he stopped reading, right? When he stops, usually when you would get up and you would read, you had to read the whole section. And Jesus was very intentional when he went to that church and he read that passage, because like a lot of more high church, you have the homilies are kind of dictated to you by the reading that you're doing. And so Jesus goes into that church on that day, stands up, reads from that passage, which is the passage, that Torah portion for that morning, and he stops reading it. And they're amazed. They're like, I don't understand. Why did he stop reading? And he says, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. But he doesn't finish it out. He says, the part that he leaves off is the day of the vengeance of our God. Right? Because he didn't come as a conqueror. He came as a healer. He came as somebody who's seeking the lost. He came bringing healing and joy and all that stuff. So that's why the Pharisees are very confused, because they're expecting him to come the first time as a conqueror. And he's not fitting that mold. So, anyway, any other questions, comments, concerns? Pushback. All right. So we'll get into more of the Beatitudes as we go through. But this is just kind of the start of the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to see a lot of this where when we recouch it and we talk about like what Jesus is actually saying, we're going to find that it's not necessarily always the way we've interpreted it before. So just kind of hang on to that nugget, and we'll come back next week, all right?
Okay.
That's all I got for you.
Great job, great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, but he set up the kingdom right away without this other.
Mhm.
All the people that are around him would have been not the nice kind of people you want to run the government.
Right.
Like today.
They're like today, yes. So you better to fix your people, get your people in line first.
Oh, yeah.
Then let them
Then they'll go right. Oh. Not now. But truthfully, I am confused about why, how the Pharisees